Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the ESRC Festival of Social Science event on climate change and criminality. I'm Sid Bandyopadhyay, a professor of economics, and with me are three other panelists, Francis Pope, my colleague and professor of atmospheric science, Cindy Buckley from Interpol, and David Lloyd, Police and Crime Commissioner of Hertfordshire. So, there are two academics and two non-academics. As you can imagine, we academics have much to theorize about, and we will theorize about the various channels through which climate change and criminality. When I tell people, they say, what's the connection? But before we do all this theorizing, let's first hear from a practitioner. So I'll first hand over to Cindy so she can say what the environmental unit at Interpol does and give you a practical idea before we come back and theorize a bit and let David have the last word. Over to you, Cindy.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Cindy Buckley. I'm Senior Operations Coordinator for Illicit Markets at Interpol. I'm seconded here from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Coast Guard Investigative Service. Prior to that, I was with U.S. Secret Service and spent a period of that time as an embedded Special Assistant United States Attorney with Department of Justice. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening, and I'd like to share with you a little bit about our program here at Interpol. So I'll share my screen. And I'm hoping everybody can see that all right.
Yep.
Okay, so what is environmental crime? Well, Interpol defines environmental crime as an international security issue that's characterized by transnational trafficking, a criminal supply chain with links to other serious crimes. And this crime area is enhanced and connected to other serious crimes. Interpol supports member countries in the fight against environmental crime, and we've done this since about 2010 when the Environmental Security Program was stood up. The Environmental Security Program essentially provides its operational and investigative support for 5 main crime areas. Those crime areas are under an umbrella and a general environmental crime umbrella that covers such crimes as fisheries crime, which are crimes that happen in the entire fisheries sector, anywhere from the harvest to the processing, and it includes food fraud at the customer level. There's forestry crime, which refers to both illegal deforestation and illicit timber trade. Those are criminal activities that destroy biodiversity and threaten the livelihood of those reliant on forest resources. And then there's illegal mining, which refers to both illegal extraction and trade of minerals, including the illegal use of toxic chemicals in mining activities. Pollution crime refers to various criminal activities such as waste crime, marine pollution crime, illicit trafficking in chemicals, carbon trading crime, and again, illegal mining. And lastly, there's wildlife crime, which refers to criminal activities involved in exploiting wildlife across the globe, threatening protected wildlife species, affecting vulnerable communities, and undermining national economies and jeopardizing food security. So we talk lately a lot about crime convergence. Environmental crime is connected to different other serious crimes, such as financial crime, corruption, arms trafficking, human trafficking, cyber and cyber-enabled crime, terrorism, and conflict. The link between environmental crime and financial crime highlights the need for law enforcement to disrupt illicit profits by tracing and preventing the movement of illicit money and assets. In the short run, the environmental crimes affect the quality of air, water, and soil, threatening the survival of species as well as human beings in certain areas, while putting at risk national socioeconomic stability. But in the long run, environmental crime affects climate change and global warming. So if you look at this graph, you can see environmental crime has terrible consequences. The consequences are not only on the environment, but they have complex socioeconomic impacts on government. Environmental crime is now estimated to be equivalent to between 110 and $281 billion annually. Environmental crime is now slightly more lucrative than human trafficking and is the third largest criminal sector worldwide. So at Interpol, what we do is provide to our member countries support in investigating environmental crimes. We provide operational support, operational deployments, trainings, environmental crime working groups, criminal intelligence analysis, and regional investigative case meetings. We continue to build upon the Quito Declaration on advancing crime, pollution, criminal justice, and the rule of law towards the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by the 14th United Nations Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, to collectively adopt effective measures to prevent and combat crimes that affect the environment, consistent with the commitments we made together in Paris in 2019. And as you can see, our activities are aligned with the goals of this meeting. Our activities ensure that member countries can respect the Paris Agreement and related commitments to specific carbon goals. Illegal logging contributes directly to climate change, accounting for a significant share of global carbon emissions, with deforestation contributing to more than 17% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, nearly as much as the entire transportation sector worldwide. In addition, it drives biodiversity loss and deprives forest communities of livelihoods, the very same communities that are considered more at risk in terms of global warming. Here at the Environmental Crimes section, we bring member countries together in the fight against forestry crime and wildlife crime, and we've done this since 2010. We're leading two series of global operations. The series of Operation Arcadia and Operation Thunder, both affecting crime areas. Amongst our activities, we have two annual global operations tackling marine pollution as well as wildlife and forestry, Operation 30 Days at Sea and Operation Thunder. You can see the participation of European countries on the slide in our annual global operations. Operation Thunder 2020 is our fourth global operation tackling both wildlife and forestry crime. It included 30 days of operation, 103 participating countries, of which 21 were European countries. 699 offenders were apprehended, and over 2,000 seizures of wildlife and forestry products that totaled almost $6 million US. So as you can see here, we have 10 years of success in the fight against forestry crime with over 900 arrests, 20 operations, 1.2 million cubic meters of timber seized, totaling 1.5 billion US dollars, and we've trained 1,000 law enforcement officers. Operation Golden Strike has recently taken place, and while we have other regional global operations such as Ikatari, which tackles fisheries crime, Operation Thunder 2020, which is tackling wildlife trade, and Operation Arcadia, which tackles forestry crime. So as far as future actions against climate change, we'll ensure the highest level of cooperation amongst member countries in the fight against environmental crime and climate change. We'll create and promote multi-agency task forces at the national level to ensure coordination between different sectors in the fight against environmental crime and climate change. And we'll strengthen coordination with key global partners from all sectors in the fight against environmental crime and climate change, and will raise awareness on the role of law enforcement in addressing climate change. Thank you, and with that, I'll turn the floor back over to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating not only to just get a glimpse of what Interpol does, but to understand the range of environmental crimes, and one, B, the impact that environmental crime has on other crime types, their sort of external effects, its links with trafficking. And actually, when we theorize a little bit, we'll talk a little bit about some of the channels there, but also the sort of, if you like, the pound impact or the dollar impact of environmental crimes on the environment. So, you know, that's a huge magnitude. And if nothing else, it'll hopefully convince you that what Francis and I are going to now theorize about is actually an extremely important problem. So what I'll do is I'll now share my screen. If you could just close your screen, Cindy. Yeah, thank you. Right, so let's start for a minute, step back from the operational and practical to the slightly more theoretical. However, don't get alarmed. We won't try to be too theoretical or too abstract, and indeed keep in whatever we say in the context of all the things that Cindy mentioned. So, for those of you who came in later, I'm Sid Vandyapadhyay, an economist, and Francis Pope, my colleague, who is a professor of atmospheric science. That's where the link is, right? I work on crime, and let me just start by telling you what this is not about, or rather, not about directly. This is not about climate change, which is, you know, a lot to do with what Francis and other colleagues do, even though climate is an extremely important problem. In fact, younger people, not surprisingly, because they have to face the impact of it, rank climate change as the #1 global challenge. And even and many other not so young people rank it quite high. Crime and crime policy, which is what I work on with many colleagues, almost always features, depending on the circumstances, in the top 5 issues that citizens care about. Both have another similarity. They're also polarizing issues. I think there's less polarization, notwithstanding the fact that there are leaders who call climate change a hoax. I think there's less disagreement about the fact that climate change is happening and that's important. But there's wide divergence of what works. In other words, to combat climate change, should we go for the market-based solutions that economists typically favor versus a more direct action by governments and citizens, perhaps a combination of both? Again, there's divergence about crime. What do we need? Do we need more bobbies on the beat? Do we need more prisons? Should we just lock everybody up and throw away the key? Or do we need to go back and look at the adverse circumstances with socioeconomic or individual that leads to criminality? And actually, it doesn't have to be either or. Uh, Unlike climate change, though, there is beginning to be sort of the glimpses of a consensus that actually there are things about crime policy which would make it better for everybody. But that's for another talk. Let's now look at what we are supposed to talk about today, which is the link between climate change and criminal behavior. So I kind of road tested this on a few people saying, I'm going to talk about climate change and criminal behavior. And while one or two people kind of talked about endangered species, most of them are saying, is there a link? What do you know about this link? So let's therefore start with some basics. The first one, which people accept quite readily, is temperature and criminality. Obviously, there's a link with environmental in terms of temperatures. Certain temperatures could make violent behavior or could have to be cues for violent behavior, especially if that's also combined with other things like alcohol consumption. But temperature also affects social interaction. For example, nice day, everybody's out on the beach, you know, more opportunities for theft. But if everybody's out on the beach, it means that there are also more unattended homes, leading to more burglaries. But it can begin to get a bit more indirect, but at the same time even more serious. This is one. If global warming, and obviously Francis will talk more about it, he's the expert, is going to cause changes in the ecosystem, including the incidence of drought and famines going up, this can lead to a lot of economic displacement. Now, of course, it can also lead to opportunistic crime. I mean, we know that, in floods and famines, just when there's been a lot of aid, there are also people who've opportunistically stolen from there. But because of economic displacements, you can also have people committing survival crimes, being lured into becoming victims of trafficking, which can lead to forced migration, some of the things that Cindy talked about. And some of this forced migration, for example, some parts of the world become just too hot to live in. There's a sudden migration, and as we know, it can often induce ethnic conflict, even though the causation is not necessarily clear. And in fact, the precise channels of many of the things that one can think about, and we have to take up some of them again in discussions and Q&A, because the effect of climate change is not exactly linear. And it varies across regions, across temperatures, across. We can take all these up because the precise channels need further investigation. Now, what we'll do, or rather Francis will do, is provide a bird's eye view of some of the channels. And before we hand over to David, and then we'll all come back to take questions and discuss. Oh, there's one thing I forgot, which I shouldn't have forgotten, but maybe Cindy sort of covered it so well that I needn't. There's a lot of issues around emission standards, pollution chasing, that and regulation, and Interpol, as well as sort of the use of data science, is developing innovative solutions to prevent people from manipulating data, to catch people who are polluting, and various other things. With that, I'll hand over to Francis.
Thank you, Sid. So Sid and I have been working on trying to work out a theoretical framework to think about climate change and criminality together. And so what we can see here is our work put in pictorial form, really. And I should also acknowledge a couple of students who have been helping us to work on this. And so that's Rosie Harris, who did a master's in air pollution, and also Ying Sangarat, who did a PhD in environmental impacts on health. So to try and put this into context, so if we start off at emissions on the left-hand side, so emissions here, I'm talking about greenhouse gases, and going up further up is also air pollution. But for the sake of this talk, and in general, I tend to think about air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions as two sides of the same coin. They have the same sources. If we burn stuff, we essentially make air pollutants, and we also create greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, etc. But if we think about the climate change impact, so we know if we put more and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, then we know that's going to increase the temperature in the atmosphere. And if we increase the temperature, that leads on to effects on precipitation. And not only do we increase the average temperature, we change the extremes that we see in temperature. And also because we're burning off the ice caps and the glaciers, we will eventually see quite significant sea level rise. And the important thing to note at this point is that the impacts of climate change are only really just beginning to bite. And so over the next century, we're going to see these effects become more and more prominent. So as we go from those impacts, we then come to some points which have more of an effect on the environment and human health. So here I've just pulled out some examples. So within that extreme weather, we have extreme heat events, heat waves, and we're seeing them happening more and more regularly. We're getting more and more severe weather events, whether this is hurricanes, etc. We're seeing changes to disease vectors. So things like mosquitoes, the range of mosquitoes in Africa, for example, are changing, and the malarial mosquito range is also changing. But this isn't just limited to Africa. We see in the UK as well that Lyme disease is on the rise, and seemingly that seems to be correlated with the range of with ticks. And we also get environmental degradation. So all these effects, these direct effects of climate change, can go on to directly affect our health. So they can affect our physical health. If we think of a simple example, just heat exhaustion will go up. There'll be more events where people become exhausted because of the heat. But it can also affect our cognitive state or our mental state. And so potentially our decision-making abilities will be affected under more extreme heats. And it's not just temperature, it's also pollution and humidity type conditions. It can also affect ecological or the environment. So we can have more droughts, we can have more floods, etc. So lots of direct effects which have a direct effect straight away on criminality. And then we get these follow-on indirect effects. And maybe the easiest one to understand of that is employment. And if we think of another simple example, if we think about farming, if you're a farmer and you farm a certain crop and that crop has a certain drought tolerance, it has a certain temperature range it wants to grow in, climate change is going to affect how good you are at growing that crop. So we can see straight away that it has impacts on employment. Following on from that, we'll have migration, and Sid and Cindy have already touched upon this. And much more contentiously, there's this idea of civil conflict linked to climate change. And that is very contentious, and the literature swings one way or the other about this. But I think you can see there could be a link there. Food production and water supply, we've touched upon. Economic impact, I mean, that clearly follows employment and forced migration, etc. And with all these things, whenever you have changes, you set up the situation where you can have inequality. So all these effects I've talked about, they won't be equal if we split the population via gender, if we split it by age, if we split it by ethnicity, if we split it by income. There's going to be lots of ways that inequalities can come in. And once you have inequalities, that sets up the conditions potentially for more victimization. So all these things is climate change. And as we've moved from left to right, none of that's so controversial. And then we make this jump into criminality. And I think, it's been great that Cindy's talked first, because that really has emphasized, there's real impact here, real monetary impact straight away. And so we've listed corruption, violence, economic, property, and victimization. And I think here for this theoretical framework, it's important that we separate the criminal from the victim, and we can see how all these different effects can affect these two things differentially. Then the red line that goes back is actually, well, how does criminality affect on climate change, upon emissions? And again, I'm really happy that Cindy's talked first, because she's made it very clear that it does impact upon it. And as Sid says, when we often talk to colleagues, that they don't necessarily get that jump, but Cindy's shown that straight away. And the final point I want to make before I pass on is the point about climate change legislation. So we've just had COP26 in Glasgow, looking to get consensus on how to change laws, etc., around emissions. And the important thing to note about laws is, by definition, if you make a law, then people can break a law. And if you allow the situation for people to break the law, you're potentially allowing criminalisation to come in via that. I think that's important to bear in mind. But hopefully that's enough food for thought for the time being. I'll pass back to Sid.
Thanks very much, Francis. Already seen questions. I'll come back to questions later, but I can see there's already a question for Cindy, and there's a question which I'm going to pass on to David after he finishes speaking. So without much ado, I'll now pass over to David, last but not the least, certainly.
Thanks very much, Sid, and it's real pleasure to be here. And as often when we have chats, you set my mind thinking. And what I was going to say first of all is, how did I approach it? And in the next sort of 5-10 minutes, I'll talk about what I do, how I've approached this question. We might want to talk about afterwards as well, what is crime and what might crime be in the future? Will those change? And then some drivers of crime, and specifically how they might be impacted by climate change. Because I think if we start at that starting point, that might get us to, well, where are the risks? Because really, this is all about some form of risk management, I think. And so I'm a police and crime commissioner. Some people will know what police and crime commissioners do. Many people don't. I suppose I've got a duty to think about strategy for the constabulary that I've been elected to broadly chair. I've got a duty to think about strategy rather than operation. People like Cindy do the operation far better than I could ever do it. So leave that to the professionals. You leave the amateurs to be the politicians. But specifically, our duty in our policing area is fourfold. It's to appoint a chief constable. It's to produce a plan, a police and crime plan, is to set a budget, and it's to hold that chief constable and a few other people to account in the delivery of that plan and that budget. And so therefore, although I hadn't really thought about it before, this is very much at the heart of what I and what fellow police and crime commissioners should be thinking about. And I thought it might be helpful for those online today just to see how I might think about it. And I have to say, when I first of all started thinking about it, my mind went immediately to black swan theory. I don't know if it did for anyone else, but for me, the immediate starting point was black swan theory. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, an event that comes as a surprise, has a major effect, inappropriately rationalized the benefit of hindsight. At least I think that's what Wikipedia, that source of all scholars, said in terms of what that was about. And specifically, I think he said that he was developing a theory to explain disproportionate role of high profile, hard to predict and rare events. But then it struck me, of course, that this is far from a black swan event, because the whole point of a black swan event is that it is hard to predict. It's something which we're not expecting. Whereas, of course, now we've got more and more evidence that climate change is happening. What was being predicted a few years back is happening more swiftly than we feared. So this is a scenario that we need to plan for. But of course, even that isn't quite right, because what we're talking about today is what if the planning goes wrong? What if we don't manage to mitigate the impacts and the harm of climate change? What's going to happen? And I think that Sid and Francis are quite right to call this summit together and actually to start thinking about some of those areas that we haven't been thinking about. Because frankly, when I talked to my constabulary, when I talked to colleagues, I think they all felt that they had somehow done the job, ticked the box. They'd already got the charging points for the green energy vehicles. They'd got the energy efficient buildings already on plan and ready to go. But actually, those aren't the important things that we do. We've got to start thinking about how we're resourcing if things go disastrously wrong, which of course they may well go wrong, and how we do that. Now, There are some of us at a certain age in this room who remember futurologists. I don't know if anyone remembers futurologists, but I remember when I first started working in Lloyd's Bank, actually, in Colmore Row in Birmingham. And when I first of all started working in Birmingham, they used to have people who came in who made a lot of money predicting what was going to happen over the next 30 or 40 years. And I have to say, 30 or 40 years hence, those very predictions, I think very few of them have actually come to pass. Not, you know, but what they did do was they got us thinking. They got us start thinking about, well, it's going to be different. The certainty is change, and that in itself is really important. So forgive me then if I start talking about, well, what is crime and what will it be? And what those drivers of crime are currently and how they might work through. I'm just thinking through as a lay person. Other people on this in this meeting will have even better ideas, will have things which I'm really looking forward to hearing about. I think it's also worth, though, you know, that political bit at the beginning. I think it was Lenin, it might not have been, who said that no society is more than 3 meals from a revolution. I think he meant 3 days. I think it was probably 3 evening meals, but that's probably a detail too far. But, you know, broadly, that we're all held in suspension. But if we start getting very hungry, if things start going horribly wrong, that we're going to want to try and change what is happening. And I think all of us, you know, have lived through times recently where we have seen that there are tensions which are raised if fuel shortages are found, if there are food shortages. And we've all seen some of that through COVID times, through post-Brexit, you know, and I think that that might just give us an idea of what might go wrong and what might go right, as long as we plan properly. But broadly, I mean, for me, I think that crime, and I'm although, you know, I enjoy criminology, I think that, but I'm no specialist, but I think that crime is driven by a number of issues. The broadest issue, and the one which probably we would all accept, although it has different impacts, is poor judgment. Poor judgment, which is often exacerbated by youth. The majority of criminals, or those starting crime, are under the age of 25, the vast majority. And we know that the brain doesn't reach full maturity until the age of 25, and the two are probably quite closely linked. Poor judgment often driven by an impact of alcohol, poor judgment often driven by an impact of drugs, or potentially a want of drugs, and therefore addiction driving criminality. Necessity is another thing which drives criminality. Perhaps some theorists who are of a different political persuasion to me would say that it is poverty which drives criminality. I'm not entirely signed up to that, but I do recognize that necessity may well drive some crime, or perceived necessity might drive it, and that's one of the areas. Then that relative poverty or relative wealth. Potentially, without trying to get judgmental, you know, that element of greed or envy as well is there. And then, of course, I suppose, those which go to perhaps almost baser instincts, the sort of the passion-driven type crime, and the fear of other type crime, which might be shown as racism, but let's call fear of other, fear of what is perceived as outsider. Now you can see how some of those things will be potentially changed, and we don't know whether or not they'll be for the better or for the worse. I have made an assumption, a huge assumption, that a catastrophic climate change means that potentially there are vast swathes of the world which are uninhabitable, either because they're underwater or because they are no longer within a temperate zone. That may well drive two definitive things: migration, and it may well drive a lack of resource, whether that's for water, whether that's for food, or other resources which are needed to live. We don't know if that will then drive what you might call state crime. It may well be that states will decide they need to invade another land, take over another land, because actually there is no space for what they need to do, or they don't have the resource for what they need to do. It may well drive that sort of state crime in terms of leadership, but it might also drive that individual crime. We may well find an increase in migrants who may not be as welcome as they should be because of that sense of fear. We may well see that it may well be that that climate change means that we lose a number of people in terms of the population. If we lose older people, that may well mean that there is proportionally more young people, and if that's the case, that may well be a driver of crime, as I've already suggested, just because of that youthfulness. Of course, if it wipes out young people, it may well mean that we have less crime. But of course, in terms of for humanity, there may be an even bigger problem of what happens to the next generation. And again, perhaps something we would need to think through. Whether the relative poverty, relative wealth would become worse. It may be that a place like the United Kingdom actually gets relatively wealthier, and that actually there are fewer people who are driven by that sort of that greed necessity driver. But it may well be that there will be more people trying, perhaps cyber enabled or whatever, to take that wealth away to drive their need to have income and perhaps elsewhere. So you can see that that's going to be really difficult. And most of all, I think actually the issue will be the gains that we have made, the gains that we've made around legitimacy in policing. And I know we're in a really difficult place at the moment about legitimacy, but I think that broadly we have become more legitimate over the last 20 or 30 years. The gains we've made as a society around taking violence against women and girls seriously, taking violence against different ethnicities seriously, taking racism seriously as crimes, I think could all be thrown out if there is a real scramble to try and ensure that people are able to live in their own country and to live well. And I think that's a really worrying area that we need to think about. And so our starting point should be that we start now by ensuring that our society is a welcoming society, is a society which is willing to accept that we're going to have change and recognize that we're part of that solution. Because unless we start doing it now, when we get to that point that we really do need to accommodate people, that we really do need to think about how we use our resources, people won't be willing to give it up. I think that probably is my opening remarks. Sorry, I always go on far longer in opening remarks than I possibly should, but I'll try and be quiet now.
That's okay, David. It was fascinating having a brush sweep of what the future could look like. Hopefully not as dystopian as some of the worst case scenarios, but it's now time for questions. I can already see questions coming up. What I would suggest to the panelists, if you look at the Q&A, that you know, you've actually been selected in many of the questions by the panel, by the audience. So perhaps if Cindy would start by answering any of the questions there directed at her, you can choose, because we may be short of time, may not be able to answer everything. So over to you, Cindy, to give short answers to whatever you choose. And
sure, I have a question. How much of an issue is organized crime considered when international collaboration between agencies is formalized? It's always considered. In fact, where environmental security is housed within Interpol falls under illicit markets, and that's part of a bigger directorate of emerging and organized crime. So just by virtue of the way we're structured, we realize that organized crime always needs to be considered when looking at environmental crimes. Environmental crimes are typically low risk, high reward crimes, and the proceeds of those crimes are often used to fund more serious crime. If you recall, I had a slide on crime convergence, and some of those more serious crimes that we think of, like terrorism and arms trafficking, human trafficking, slavery, various financial crimes are always issues that we look at very carefully when we're investigating environmental crimes. Another question, what is the potential for law enforcement and investigative agencies to work with indigenous communities and environmental activists to protect people, livelihoods, and the planet? We as law enforcement kind of used to work in a vacuum, but now we're realizing that we have to work with other people beyond the law enforcement community, other stakeholders and other non-governmental entities, so that we can do our jobs better. So indeed, that is already being considered. Let's see, could I give some ideas about how fisheries crime might change as a result of climate change? For example, temperature-mediated redistribution of resources. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really quite complicated. But obviously, if you have temperatures changing in the ocean, it could trigger changes in migration patterns of different types of fish species that are fished in a certain area. And as a result, a country that may have been relying on fish as a protein source for their food security may have to leave a place where they're normally legally fishing and go out and find another place to fish where they may be encroaching on another country's waters and their livelihood. But another idea I have is even with illegal mining activities, you might be taking away land that had previously been used as a farm. So again, you're impacting global food and protein security. See, and I think that was about it for my questions.
there may be more. We can again come back to it.
Yes.
But can I pass the question on social harm? I mean, I could answer it to an extent, but pass it on to David as the amateur criminologist. You're on mute, David.
You're quite right. I'm on mute, and I was looking at a different set of questions. So what I'm going to do is first,
actually, if you look at the comment box,
yes, I was looking at the Q&A box. So I think that I saw this actually before I started, and to an extent, I started to try to deal with some of it because
Yes,
I think
you
you're
have
quite right.
actually. Which is why I'm letting you complete what you started.
I think you're quite right. There will be those who claim that this is that climate change in itself is a crime, so in some ways, and at the beginning I said, I think that it may be that we will change our view to say that the crimes are different, although I think that broadly there are only three crimes. I think if you want to try and boil it down, there are three crimes. One is that you harm someone, one is that you deprive them of their property, and one is that you tell a lie. I mean, those are really the three basic crimes. Clearly there are different ways of dressing it up, but those are the three different crimes. And to that extent, environmental crime, green crime, is really just still that you might argue that it's all three, but it's really around that harming others, harming the planet. But I am certain that we will have different measures for what's important as crime. I think that broadly, we have seen over the last 20 or 30 years that we have both recognized and seen as even more important the crimes which occur in a personal space. And we have seen fewer crimes taking place in a public space. It may well be that we then move on to a point of recognizing that the biggest crime of all is a crime against the planet. But that feels more as if it's in a politician's area to discuss in some ways than it is in a criminologist's area.
Thank you, Francis.
I mean, just on that point, I think the interesting bit on Paul Betts' question is maybe how do you apportion blame? I think it's fairly easy to argue that it is a crime, but do we suddenly make the 68 million people in the UK criminals because of climate change? I don't know, maybe push that question back to David, but that's the bit I struggle with, is apportioning blame. And maybe Cindy's got something to say on that as well. And maybe Paul's got something to say in the chat as well, I don't know.
Well, yeah, go on, David.
Crime, I mean, it is really quite interesting, isn't it? Because in many ways, our tradition has been about prosecuting crimes as a state rather than as individuals. So, for example, and I'm often concerned about it because, for example, if clearly those which you might almost call state crimes, rape, murder, they will be posted as R standing for Rex or Regina, king or queen, versus, meaning the state, against whoever the defendant is. And the complainant isn't mentioned. And in many ways, our whole process then is to say, what you have offended against really is against our rules and our society, more so than saying that you have offended against that individual. That's almost an aside. Now, there's a lot of criminology and victim theory around that, which I don't think is what you want to talk about. But to an extent, if we were to say it's a crime against the state, you can see that already there is something there which starts to say this is a bigger thing than an individual, so that we wouldn't necessarily be saying there are however many billion victims of this. But I think that it's unlikely that we would want to take on state versus state in terms of how we do it, although clearly some of that finger pointing is already happening at places like COP26 or wherever, where we say this is not entirely, but this is broadly a problem with developing nations and the US in terms of their use of energy. And, perhaps it would be useful for us to reflect on these sorts of, well, where does the crime actually sit, rather than blaming states.
I think that's a really important point. And can I just interject here, which I think might also answer another question, I think, from Christelle. I think one of the problems with many things around environmental degradation has simply been the lack of property rights or commonly held property, which is why you cannot actually apportion the blame on anybody. And that's why we've had this so-called, I mean, after all, a lot of the degradation of the environment is sort of the old tragedy of the commons, because no one owns the environment. They only take into account the harm that they might cause, which affects them from harming the environment, which is negligible for an individual, but they don't account for societal costs. And it's therefore the lack of property rights or what we would call kind of a missing market, because you can't really create a market except artificially, which people have tried to combat environment, which has caused countries to continually pursue a short-term growth path without taking into account the harm caused to future generations because there was no property rights held on it. And I think that sort of, in some sense, addresses, or at least addresses one aspect, even though Paul might not agree, of Paul's question around how do you apportion harm and what are the challenges in doing that? I mean, is it an individual, is it a state, is it as citizens? We have collectively committed a kind of, environmental genocide, if you like, or about to, and so we know the total harm from that. But is there a collective responsibility? Can that be translated and into an individual responsibility? We try to now do that through sort of tax and permits and things like that. So I think yes, we do first of all need to develop a theory of from moving from collective harm to individual harm. And second, yes, it is precisely the lack of property rights on the environment which has caused, sort of what are now the developed industrial nations to pollute freely, leaving us with something which might turn out to be catastrophic. But I can see more questions and things that people might want to take up. There were some specific questions around enforcement. I'm not sure if this is, have time for details of that, but I'll let Cindy decide if she wants to answer any of them. I mean, some of them are quite nitty-gritty details, might not be able to have a complete answer, but over to you, Cindy, if you want to say anything. Otherwise, we'll come back for some more discussion.
Yeah, I see one here about challenges in regulating environmental crimes because of cross-border transnational elements of the crimes. Yeah, absolutely, it's a problem. And countries or people can't go it alone. I mean, we have to look at multilaterally working on these issues, and that's one really great thing about being here at Interpol is I'm now working with a group from all over the world to tackle these particular types of environmental crimes.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there are really interesting questions also around, experiences of crimes in Hertfordshire, specific things. We can come back to this after we perhaps look at some of the major points. And I know that none of us answered that question around land and ethnic conflict. I think it's a really challenging question to which I'm happy to sort of look at that. But yeah, I mean, resource conflict has always been an issue. And as David pointed out, if this becomes worse with climate change, you would see the kind of attacks that have been on indigenous people and trying to wipe things out. It's a really challenging thing. It's a real challenge, I think, for law enforcement as well. I think, as both Cindy has briefly touched on it, and David has also mentioned, I think it's ripe for discussion. I'm not sure we have very good answers yet to it, but and people, we are nearing sort of the end of the session, and I'm not going to stop exactly at 8. If people want to, you can feel free to discuss a little bit more. But since we are just got 5 minutes left, could I suggest all the panelists take exactly a minute to sum up with any thoughts, whether it's of a practical nature, whether it's philosophical, anything. So this time I'll change the order and I'll start with Francis.
Thanks, Ed. At least time to think. So it's been a fascinating talk, and it's clearly a super important topic area. And there's lots of unknowns in there. And one of the unknowns, I guess, I wonder about is how much of it's differential. So as we go to a warmer world, there'll be impacts initially, but do we get used to those impacts to a degree? Probably not all round, but that's something I don't have an answer for yet. I guess the bit I really like to get, I mentioned it earlier, but is Cindy really showing that the criminality can impact on climate change as well? It's not a one-way street. So there is feedbacks in there, and there's potentially negative feedbacks in there. So I think there's a lot to explore and unpack going forwards. And then the other point, again, this was from Cindy's book, but she pointed out the SDGs, and we all very happily talk around the SDGs. And SDG 16, peace, justice and strong associations, is clearly the one where the criminality is most tightly coupled with SDG 13, climate change. But I think it's clear that climate change needs to be fought holistically across all the SDGs. It is an existential threat. And so I've long argued for this, but I think whoever comes up with the next set of SDGs, there shouldn't be an SDG 13 on climate change. It's just all the SDGs should have climate change at the heart of it. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Francis. Cindy, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just leave it with saying climate change is an important issue, and it's something that we as individuals or individual law enforcement entities or even countries can't work on alone or in a vacuum. We need to partner, and we need to partner with beyond the government to the private sector and non-governmental entities to solve these complicated problems.
That's great. And I think that's one of the things we didn't actually touch on, because we talked about state regulation and so on. From my experience, David usually has something interesting to say about private regulation or private enterprise. So, David.
Well, I mean, you know that I'm a libertarian, and I very much believe in the value of the individual. And indeed, I think that the way that we manage to solve this is actually starting at that bottom up. I know that there are many billions of people across the planet, but actually, if we think of our individual responsibility, rather than saying, is this a state regulation issue? Is this something at the very top? But actually take on ourselves what we have to do. And then in working bottom up, you just reminded me, and it's been really helpful to be able to remind me how we need to ensure that all of us who have responsibility for writing plans, for setting budgets, actually start thinking about some of these issues in a far more serious way than we have. Because of course, what this is an important problem rather than an urgent one. It's becoming urgent, but it's still far enough away that we can do something about it in terms of that planning. And I think that we need to make this, as well as many other questions, more urgent. We need to start thinking strategically rather than just operationally.
Fantastic. So I think it's been really fascinating. One of the things which obviously we didn't have time to discuss, but nonetheless, which strikes me, given the questions that have come up around, the common good and sort of misappropriation of public goods, because it's very hard even now to really enforce some of it. We haven't really talked about, well, what about technology? I mean, and can we incentivize people so that they can actually come up with revolutionary solutions? It's I think harder to change human nature. It's probably easier to invent something, and I recognize this. I'm just throwing it up. I'm not sort of suggesting this as a personal view, but I think if you're thinking of again thinking of terms of national and international budgets, I mean, should we be funding the next big innovation so that we actually have to enforce less? I mean, will that solve the problem, or do we actually need a sea change in the way we think about ourselves and the world? I'm not sure. I don't think anybody can be sure, even if they think they are. It's exactly 8 p.m. I'm sure the panelists are happy to stay for a couple of more minutes if there are more questions. But otherwise, it's been really fascinating. Thanks very much, Cindy and David, for joining me, and Francis, that we can have a really rounded discussion of what climate change and criminalities, the links are. As Francis pointed out, the links can be reversed. I mean, I think we both learned a lot from listening to Cindy and David's views. So thanks very much. And thanks to the great audience for the extremely thought-provoking questions. Even if we haven't answered all of them satisfactorily, it gives us food for thought. So thank you very much. But yeah, if there are any other couple of questions, I'm sure we can take it. Otherwise, I wish you all a good evening. No final questions, at least for now. Thanks, everybody. It's been great. Hopefully, we can do something which again brings big social science problems to the public next year. So, I guess we should also thank ESRC for this opportunity. I've been doing this for about 8 years on different topics. I found this fascinating. It's really helped me think about things. Thanks, everybody, and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.